Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. My name is Hannah, and I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a second-generation Bosnian American. My parents came here separately in the early 90s, and after meeting in a Bosnian restaurant on Union Road, they started dating and eventually got married. I was born in October 1996, and apparently, my parents were both very happy during that first year of my life. But the very hazy memories I have of my father from that time are the only ones I have of him, if they're not just false memories planted there after hearing 100,000 anecdotes about him being such a wonderful person and a perfect father during my first year. But then, I suppose you're wondering how a man who walked out on my mother and me is remembered so affectionately, in fact, that some people still call him a hero. Well, if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. My father grew up in a small Bosnian village called Obadi, which, at the time, was part of the now-defunct nation of Yugoslavia. From what my mom has told me, it must have been a beautiful place to grow up, nestled in the mountains, surrounded by forests for hunting and streams for fishing. For almost 2 generations following World War II, there was a long and uninterrupted peace in the region. But then, and I'm ready to skip over a lot of history here, war came. And when it came, it was very bad. Because it was based along ethnic lines, the Yugoslav Civil War was a real, depressing, neighbor versus neighbor kind of war. It was so bloody that it sparked a number of smaller, more localized conflicts, including the Bosnian Civil War. It was during this war that my dad escaped Bosnia. My mom and her side of the family had left a little earlier, so while they suffered through some of the war's early stages, they thankfully escaped before the worst of it in Bosnia began. My dad, on the other hand, stayed in Obadi to protect his family. Even when other Bosnian families were fleeing to Europe, the UK, or America, he didn't think they had anything to worry about. Without getting into too much detail, and please don't crucify me in the comments for oversimplifying this, the factions in the Bosnian Civil War were as follows. The Serbs were the minority, while the Bosnians and the Croats formed the majority. At first, the Bosnians and Croats were on the same side, so it looked like they were going to win. But then the Bosnian Serbs started receiving backing from their much stronger motherland, Serbia, which turned the tide of the battle and prolonged the war. So my dad and his family went from feeling safe up in the mountains to having Serb forces getting closer and closer each day. The men of the village formed a militia and held the line as long as they could before they were forced back into Obadi. But by that time, they had managed to evacuate their vulnerable family members. When the Serbs finally surrounded the village, the fight was to keep them from burning it to the ground. My mom said that, according to my dad, there had always been hope in Obadi, hope that they could hold off the Serbs until NATO committed to driving them back. But as the Serbs surrounded the village and their snipers began picking off the Bosnian militia one by one, my dad and his friends realized they were doomed. And even worse, their families were in danger, too. Believing they could hold off the Serbs long enough, the men of Obadi had told their women and children to wait in a neighboring village. But unless they warned them of the imminent attack, they too would be surrounded, captured, and quite possibly massacred. The militia had no choice but to try to break through the encirclement, but given how outnumbered and outgunned they were, that option was considered a death sentence. One early morning, in absolute desperation, my dad went out into the woods to find a way through the Serb lines. Incredibly, he found one. The Serbs had neglected to properly guard an open field on the eastern side of Obadi, just beyond some trees. Presumably, they believed my dad and his comrades weren't dumb enough to run through an open field, especially with snipers in the surrounding hills. But that assumption gave the Bosnian militia a golden opportunity for escape, an opportunity to circle around the Serbian lines and rescue their families. My dad's fellow militiamen asked if he was sure the way was clear. When he told them yes, they moved as quietly as they could, reaching the clearing just as the sun was rising ahead of them. They started running through the open field, through the supposed gap in the Serbian lines. They were yelling at my dad, calling him a genius, saying he had saved them. Then, just as they were all nicely grouped in the center of that clearing, the Serbs opened fire. They didn't have a chance. The men were shot down, mowed by machine guns or picked off by Serb snipers. My dad said all he could do was run and pray a bullet didn't find him. And by some miracle, he made it to the tree line, escaping the Serbs. He then circled around behind them as they swept in to finish off the wounded and burn a body to the ground. While the Serbs looted and torched what was left of the village, my dad reached the neighboring village where their families were hiding and warned them to flee. He had seen his comrades slaughtered, and he had made his decision. He was getting out of Bosnia. He didn't stop until he, his mother, and his aunt were on a plane to the United States, where they would eventually settle in St. Louis. My grandma, God rest her soul, wouldn't shut up about how heroic my dad was. She'd say he led a near unwinnable charge against the Serbs to save his family and others. She called him the only survivor of his militia unit, saying God must have blessed him to walk away from that bloodbath. But my mom said my dad hated when she talked like that. She always assumed it was survivor's guilt. Then, about 18 months into their marriage, just before I turned 1, they had a catastrophic fight. That was when my dad revealed the truth. My father hadn't accidentally gotten anyone killed. He did it on purpose. That morning, he wasn't scouting Serbian lines, he was looking for the Serbs themselves. And he did it while waving a white flag of surrender. They took him prisoner, brought him to their commander, and asked if he was an envoy sent to announce Obadi's surrender. He said no. He told them the village and militia would die before surrendering. But unlike them, he didn't want to die. The Serbs laughed. Then he made them an offer. He would hand over the entire militia so they could be slaughtered in one fell swoop. All he asked in return was to walk away when the shooting stopped. And that's exactly what happened. Dad ushered his comrades out into the open but didn't run at the head of them. He simply waited at the tree line, watching as the Serbs cut them down in a prearranged ambush. When it was over, when the Serb commander yelled for his men to stop shooting, my father stepped over the bodies of his lifelong friends and walked away. He knew the Serbs could have shot him, and at times, he wished they had. But they knew the worst punishment was letting him live with what he had done. So he buried it. Let others believe his story was one of heroism rather than betrayal. Until one night, when he finally confessed everything to my mother. And then he left. And never came back. I could seek him out. Maybe I should. But I'm afraid. Not of what he did, of what he might have become. I know that if he hadn't done what he did, I might not be here to write this. But all the reasoning and rationalizing in the world won't change what he did. Many years ago, in a land far from these shores, a man makes a speech in front of a crowd of villagers, and they hang on to his every word. No one dares speak, and no one dares look away. When the man finishes speaking, he takes out a lighter and sparks a flame. Behind him, a woman stands tied to a wooden post with a gasoline-soaked motorcycle tire around her neck. So much of the flammable liquid has dripped and soaked into the earth around her that the man only needs to toss the lighter at her feet to ignite the fumes and set her ablaze. As the woman screams, no one in the crowd says a word. Most have known the woman their whole lives. She is an elder in the village, a woman of influence. But as the flames roast her alive and her shrieks saturate the air around them, no one in the crowd raises a single word of protest. And the woman's crime? The theft of a tiny ball of opium from a rustic processing center hidden away in the jungles of western Myanmar. She told the man who burned her alive that her son was suffering from a broken arm, and since she couldn't afford medicine on her meager salary, she'd stolen the opium in the hopes of relieving his pain. He was said to have listened intently, as if he deeply sympathized with the woman's dilemma. And then, once he secured a full confession, he sentenced her to death. Judge, jury, and executioner. That man, who set a person on fire as easily as you or I would light a candle, was the head enforcer for a group of heroin smugglers based in what's known as the Golden Triangle out in Southeast Asia. The woman wasn't the first he'd killed, nor was her execution the most cruel or gruesome he'd performed. He'd dispatched hundreds over the years. Hundreds of thieves, hundreds of rule breakers, hundreds of escaping workers who tried to leave before their contracts were up. All shot, hanged, beheaded, or torched. And that's how they enforced discipline out there. How they kept poor workers in line when there was so much money flowing in from all the Americans coming over to buy their heroin. That man, that cold-blooded killer, was one of the most highly respected and highly feared men in the global heroin trade. And that man was my grandfather. He did that job for just over 10 years, from his late 20s to just after his 40th birthday when he realized he needed to get out. I don't know all the details of why he had to leave, but I just know his life was in danger, and so were those of my mom and aunts. I guess if you kill so many people, you probably make a few enemies. So my grandpa gathered up as much money as possible, had himself and his family smuggled into Vietnam, and then they bought a bunch of fake South Vietnamese diplomatic passports. They basically just walked onto an Air Force passenger plane like they were VIP refugees. All the big South Vietnamese politicians were leaving the country, stealing anything that wasn't tied down to ensure the communists didn't get their hands on it. So when Grandpa showed up to the airport in a crisp business suit, with a couple of suitcases stuffed with $100 bills, no one batted an eyelid when he and his family politely demanded a place on an outbound transport plane. Once he and his family arrived in America, they settled in the Bay Area, and my grandpa used his money to invest in small businesses, usually of Southeast Asian origin. He had stakes in banh mi stores, Thai restaurants, Filipino grocery stores, you name it, and Grandpa was making money from it. Which is how he managed to get even richer on this side of the Pacific Ocean. He lived the life of a legitimate businessman for another 40 years. And then, after successfully fighting off cancer not once, but twice, it came back a third time, and the prognosis was terminal. He went to his deathbed having never spoken of what he did back in Myanmar. My grandma had some idea of what he did back then, enough to know Grandpa might have killed some people, but she had no clue just how vast and varied his crimes really were. It took until he was on his deathbed, and a sudden conversion to Catholicism prompting a full and unfettered confession, that we learned just how monstrous he used to be. My mom said that over the course of around 2 to 3 days, he was visited by the same priest over and over, and in that time, he made dozens of intricate confessions, stopping only when he needed to rest. Mom said it was all terrible stuff. Stuff so terrible that she could barely believe it. She thought at one point that my grandpa might have been delirious or maybe hallucinating. She and Grandma tried to put a stop to it. Like, he doesn't know what he's saying. But he did. He knew exactly what he was saying. He might have been slipping off his mortal coil, as they say, but his mind was still very much intact. And once he'd made that clear to the priest, the confessions continued. Now, like I said, there were many. But according to my mom, this one was the one that always stuck with her. To just about any big money business, security is one of the most important aspects of day-to-day operations, and my grandpa and his employers ran their territory like it was their own sovereign state. They basically had their own border police, what amounted to their own army and air force, and even their own ID cards that they gave to workers so they knew who was who. They were able to operate with such freedom by bribing government officials, but it didn't ensure complete autonomy, not to mention that everything had to operate under a shroud of total SE. So when a large American NGO suddenly showed up in the Myanmar section of the Golden Triangle and started going from village to village vaccinating children, it wasn't a good thing for my grandpa and his bosses. It was a huge, huge problem. All the right government officials had been bought, but if the Americans got wind that the heroin producers had turned a huge chunk of the western province into a giant heroin factory, there'd be trouble. This was at the height of the Vietnam War, too. And although the American public didn't know about U.S. Special Forces roaming around countries they shouldn't have been in, the people in those countries sure as hell did. At first, it seemed like the villagers were receptive to the organization's requests. But then, once the NGO actually started sending people to the villages, along with government representatives who spoke their language, a lot of the villagers realized they were being duped. The NGOs were smart. They didn't just show up with white coats and big needles, looking incredibly creepy. They gave out basic medications at first: aspirin, hydration powders, baby formula, snacks for the kids. Anything that would have an instant impact and win the villagers' trust. As you can imagine, to people who'd never really experienced modern medicine before, their efforts were a resounding success. And dozens of families from each village approached the NGO as subtly as they could and secretly got their kids some shots. Well, word got back to the organization, and they put my grandpa onto the task of administering those punishments. They got the names of every family whose child had been vaccinated, then went around the villages taking away the kids who had gotten shots. And I don't know how they did it exactly, Grandpa never said. But I know that they returned those kids to the villages. Just, not to their homes. They stacked their bodies in big piles just outside the villages they came from and left them there for the villagers to find. And it was my grandfather who killed each and every one of them en masse by poisoning their food and water. The priest was just as pale and aghast as my mom and grandma. The only reason my mom ended up telling me this was because I wanted to visit Myanmar to see the places she and grandpa had come from. And I pushed, and she kept pushing back, until one day, she finally caved. She told me everything. I can't visit my mother country because there are still people in Myanmar who'd kill me if they knew who my grandfather was. And not just people in Shan province taking revenge for their murdered kids. I'm talking government officials who could quite easily make a person disappear. And I mean really disappear. At its inception, the United States proudly cast off the shackles of subjugation and severed its bonds to the British Crown. Yet over the next 200 years, through wealth, media, and influence, America ended up electing its own aristocracy. Be it the Bushes, the Kardashians, the Vanderbilts, or the Roosevelts, certain families have firmly established themselves as the upper echelon of American society. Perhaps none more so than the Kennedys. The Kennedy family is one of the most prominent and influential political dynasties in American history. Their American story began with Patrick Kennedy, an immigrant from County Wexford, Ireland, who settled in Boston in 1849. His son, P.J. Kennedy, became a successful businessman and politician, laying the foundation for the family's meteoric rise. However, it was his grandson, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., who propelled the family to immense wealth and influence. Joe Kennedy Sr. was a savvy businessman who amassed a fortune through banking, real estate, the stock market, and the liquor trade, most notably during the Prohibition era, which gave rise to gangsters and bootleggers alike. Despite dipping his toes into the criminal underworld, Joe Sr. later married Rose Fitzgerald, daughter of Boston Mayor John Fitzgerald, solidifying the family's political ambitions. He served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom in the late 1930s but soon turned his ambitions toward his children, grooming them for leadership and public service. Perhaps the most famous of Joe Kennedy's children was his second son, John F. Kennedy, commonly known as JFK. He became the 35th President of the United States, leading the country through the Cuban Missile Crisis and advancing civil rights before his assassination in 1963, which shocked the world. His younger brother, Robert Kennedy, served as U.S. Attorney General and later as a senator from New York. A fierce advocate for civil rights and anti-poverty programs, Robert was assassinated in 1968 during his presidential campaign. The youngest Kennedy brother, Ted, served as a U.S. senator, while their older sister, Jean, was the 17th U.S. ambassador to Ireland. Yet there was another Kennedy sibling, one whose story remained a closely guarded family secret for decades, Rosemary Kennedy. Rosemary Kennedy was born at her parents' home in Brookline, Massachusetts, on September 13, 1918. Named after her mother, Rose Fitzgerald, her birth was complicated by a shortage of doctors due to the Spanish flu pandemic. To delay delivery until a doctor arrived, the family nurse instructed Rose to keep her legs closed. This decision resulted in young Rosemary's head being trapped in the birth canal for 2 hours, depriving her of oxygen. As Rosemary grew, her parents noticed she was missing key developmental milestones. By age 2, she struggled to sit up and crawl, while other children her age had already begun walking. Yet rather than openly acknowledging Rosemary's intellectual disability, her parents hid it from friends and the public, confiding only in a small circle of family members. Determined to help her catch up, the Kennedys hired a family tutor. When it became clear she required more specialized support, they sent her to a Pennsylvania boarding school for children with intellectual disabilities. At 16, she moved to the Sacred Heart Convent in Elmhurst, Rhode Island, where she was educated separately from other students to keep her condition a secret. Reports indicated her reading, writing, spelling, and counting skills were at a 4th-grade level. During her late teens, Rosemary led an active social life, read books, and even joined her family on state visits abroad. She was by no means an invalid, and while her intellect lagged behind her siblings, she could best be described as childish rather than incapacitated. In a carefully orchestrated interview with Woman's Day magazine, she claimed to be studying to become a kindergarten teacher and had dreams of working in social services or even acting. However, this polished public image was an illusion. When reporters from the Boston Globe requested an interview, Rosemary's father's assistant tailored her responses, which she memorized after hours of coaching. In a prepared statement, she declared, "I have always had serious tastes and understand life is not given to us just for enjoyment. For some time, I have been studying the well-known psychological method of Dr. Maria Montessori, and I got my degree in teaching last year." In 1938, Rosemary traveled to the United Kingdom, where she met King George VI at Buckingham Palace. She practiced the royal curtsy for hours beforehand, yet at the event itself, she stumbled and nearly fell before hundreds of onlookers. With characteristic British grace, the crowd ignored the mishap, and King George warmly welcomed her. Her mother never discussed the incident, instead treating the event as a triumph, proof that Rosemary had conquered her disability and anxiety to meet the King of England. Unfortunately, this was the peak of her social success. Upon returning to the U.S. in 1940, a 22-year-old Rosemary began exhibiting troubling behavior. She would fly into violent rages, destroy property, and even attack family members. Some of these outbursts ended in convulsions or full-blown seizures. After being expelled from a summer camp in western Massachusetts, she was sent to a convent school in Washington, D.C. There, Rosemary rebelled, sneaking out at night. The nuns suspected she was engaging in romantic encounters and warned her of the risks of pregnancy and disease. Whether she was truly searching for romance or simply freedom, her behavior alarmed her parents. As her outbursts continued, they feared her actions would damage their political standing. In the fall of 1941, at just 23 years old, Rosemary was subjected to a procedure considered the cutting edge of psychiatric treatment at the time, but which is now seen as a barbaric crime against humanity. Without informing his wife, Joe Kennedy Sr. arranged for Rosemary to undergo a lobotomy. Lobotomies, developed in the 1930s and 40s, involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe to treat mental illness. The procedure was performed by Dr. James W. Watts and Dr. Walter Freeman. Using a surgical knife resembling a butter knife, they cut into Rosemary's brain while asking her to recite the Lord's Prayer or count backward. When she became incoherent, they stopped. The results were catastrophic. Rosemary was left unable to walk or talk and was permanently incontinent. Her mental capacity was reduced to that of a toddler. She was institutionalized, first at Craig House in New York, and later at St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Wisconsin, where she remained for the rest of her life. Joe Kennedy Sr. never visited his daughter again. Her mother waited 20 years before seeing her. Her siblings were not even informed of her whereabouts. The family publicly claimed Rosemary was merely reclusive and private, hiding the truth until JFK's presidency in 1961. When they admitted she had an intellectual disability, though they never disclosed the lobotomy. It wasn't until 1987 that historian Doris Kearns Goodwin revealed the full truth. The public was horrified. By then, lobotomies were widely condemned as cruel and unnecessary, a stark contrast to their acceptance in the 1940s. Rosemary Kennedy passed away on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86. In her final years, her siblings reintegrated her into family life, improving her quality of life. Despite the suffering she endured, her story inspired change. Her sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded the Special Olympics, ensuring Rosemary's legacy would be one of inclusion rather than exclusion. Though isolated in life, in death, she was finally reunited with her family, buried beside them in Hollowwood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.